Hello to all of you viewers of The Pioneer. How are you? I hope you're all healthy and well. Today we're talking about an issue about modern war that's not only on the front lines but also behind the scenes. As the Russia-Ukraine war rages on, the balance within Russia itself is gradually deteriorating. There's great unrest in the autonomous republics and various regions. People living under Moscow's authority are reacting more and more vociferously against the Kremlin's policies. Particularly in the early stages of the war, the Putin administration was largely successful in mobilizing the Russian people and convincing them of the necessity of the war. But as the war dragged on and casualties mounted, this support slowly began to erode. In many parts of Russia, especially in the autonomous regions where monetary communities are concentrated, there is growing resistance to the government's conscription policies. As the Kremlin has stepped up pressure to recruit new soldiers for the army, this pressure has turned into anger in some regions. Reports from independent sources and social media indicate that small-scale riots have broken out in different parts of Russia. Moscow is trying to cover up such reports with strict censorship. While the Russian state media hasn't said a word about these developments, public reactions and resistance movements are becoming increasingly visible on social media platforms. But what's at the heart of these uprisings? Why are people not heeding the Kremlin's calls? Let's take a look at these developments together. Before we get to our report, though, a quick reminder. The Pioneer team is definitely real. None of my team members or me are artificial intelligence. Even though AI is very advanced, it's still not as good as us. By the way, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss our daily reports and explanations. We do read all the comments you leave on our videos, so please continue to share your ideas about our content. Tell us in the comments what content you'd like to see on the Pioneer channel. And now let us begin if you're ready. The Pioneer reports. As the war in Ukraine rages on, Russia is facing a serious crisis not only on the front lines, but also on its own soil. Unrest in various parts of the country has escalated into mass protests and then direct clashes with security forces. These protests, which at first appear to be isolated incidents, are evolving into large-scale riots as the population increasingly reacts against conscription and the devastating effects of the war. These events have been triggered by the severe effects of the war on the Russian people. In particular, the harsh introduction of conscription has sparked anger in many regions. While young adults and their families who do not want to be forcibly conscripted sought various ways to react to the situation, in some regions these reactions turned into acts of violence, with attacks on recruitment centers and government buildings. The civil unrest across Russia is being suppressed by the government's harsh security measures. But despite the harsh reactions of law enforcement, the number of protesters is growing and challenges to state authority are becoming bolder. In particular, raids on military branches reveal the extent of the riots. In some areas, protesters have organized against authorities who are trying to forcibly send young adults to the front lines by seizing recruitment documents that are about to be burned. These events are not just a youth movement. Different segments of the population have also begun to react. Deepening economic hardship, rising food prices, and rising unemployment are triggering general dissatisfaction among the Russian people. The burden of war weighs heavily not only on the shoulders of the soldiers fighting on the front lines, but also on the civilian population, which is struggling with economic hardship. The devastating impact of international sanctions on the economy is stoking public anger and undermining trust in the government. At the same time, in some areas, insurgencies have begun to directly target state institutions. Unidentified groups have reportedly attacked security posts and administrative buildings, and arson attacks with Molotov cocktails have been carried out against government buildings, especially at night. These attacks show that the Russian government faces serious challenges in ensuring internal security. Videos circulating on social media make it clear that the security forces are inadequate to respond to these incidents and are struggling to maintain control in some areas. Resistance to conscription is taking different forms. In some regions, clandestine networks have been established, and these networks have developed various methods to prevent youngsters from being conscripted. Strategies used by these groups include hiding young adults, creating other identities with false documents, and organizing their illegal exit from the country. This process is not only a rebellion against the conscription law, but also a manifestation of the Russian people's reaction to the administration's war policies in general. People have realized that the war has caused serious destruction not only in Ukraine, but also inside Russia. Despite increasing repression and censorship efforts, the images disseminated through independent news outlets and social media clearly show the extent of the internal crisis facing the Russian leadership. These developments represent a major challenge for the Kremlin. While the war in Ukraine continues with serious losses for the Russian army, domestic unrest has forced the government to fight on two fronts. Making military conscription compulsory has increased popular resistance, making riots inevitable. If these protests and uprisings continue to spread, Russia could face a much bigger crisis. Especially for young adults and their families who do not want to serve in the army, this process has turned into a struggle for survival. While the calls for voluntary mobilization in the first months of the war did not attract enough attention, the introduction of compulsory military conscription has escalated public anger and created greater resistance against the state. This shows how difficult it is for the Russian government to sustain its war policies. Economic hardship is also a critical factor in the growth of these uprisings. People are fed up with both the casualties at the front and the financial burden of the war, which directly affects their lives. Rising unemployment, rising inflation, and an economic crisis exacerbated by international sanctions have undermined confidence in the government and led the administration to increase pressure on the population. But instead of suppressing popular anger, it's fueling it. What do you think? Can Russia's internal turmoil and growing popular anger change the course of the war? In addition to the losses on the front, how will this crisis on the domestic front affect Moscow's war strategy? If these rebellions continue to grow, what will the Russian leadership do? Let us know in the comments. We read and care about your points of view.